Hi, I'm Rob Haig, an Associate City Planner and a member of the Advancing Equity and Rezoning project team. During this presentation, we're going to take a deeper dive into zoning to ensure that we're all on the same page as we begin to talk about the rezoning process. During this presentation, we will start by defining zoning in the Denver Zoning Code. Then we will discuss the things that zoning regulates. And finally, we will discuss how zoning works in Denver. To start, let's look at a definition of zoning. Zoning refers to the laws, rules, and regulations that govern how property can be used in different geographic areas known as zone districts. Each zone district has different rules for how property can be used and developed. The map on the right is an aerial image of northern Denver with different colors defining different zone districts. The yellow and straw colors are residential zones, the red areas are mixed-use zones, and the purple areas have industrial zoning. Let's talk about the work that CPD does in order to put zoning into context. Our work can be broken down into two types. First is the planning work. Our department works with the community to create different types of plans. These are the citywide, neighborhood, and small area plans that ultimately become the policy documents that set the vision and framework under which future decisions are made. The second type of work is our regulatory work. This includes creating and updating the rules and regulations that inform land use and development. These rules and regulations also include processes for development, including rezoning, which is the focus of this project. Following this regulatory work, development proposals are reviewed against these regulatory tools to ensure that development proceeds in conformance with the city's vision. Let's talk briefly about how we got to our current zoning. In 1956, the City of Denver adopted former Chapter 59 zoning. This was the former Chapter 59 of the Denver Revised Municipal Code. Then in 2010, the Denver Zoning Code was adopted to more accurately reflect the vision expressed in our citywide plans. The Denver Zoning Code provides more predictability of outcomes, including factors like building height and permitted uses. When the new code was adopted, most properties in the city were rezoned to zone districts in the new code. However, some properties were not rezoned into the new code because they had site-specific custom elements, and there was no like for like to make a transition from former Chapter 59 zoning to a zone district under the new Denver Zoning Code. While this project will focus on a change to the Denver Zoning Code, since all rezonings in the city will result in a Denver Zoning Code zone district and follow the processes in the Denver Zoning Code, all rezonings will be subject to these changes. There are two main components of zoning. The first component is the zoning code, which has the written text identifying all the rules, requirements for each zone district. As a reminder, each zone district has different rules for how property can be used and developed. The second component is the map, which identifies the location and boundaries of each zone district. The map on the right shows different colors that represent different zone districts. So let's put this together in an example. If you had a property in Denver and you wanted to find out your zoning, you would first look at the zoning map to see which zone district applies to your property. Then you would be able to find your zone district in the zoning code in order to look up the rules, requirements, regulations for your property. So now that we know how zoning is applied to a property, let's talk about what zoning regulates. It regulates the minimum lot size, width, and depth. Zoning regulates the number of structures or buildings that are allowed, as well as the standards, including height and general location. Zoning regulates the uses that are allowed on a property. It regulates parking requirements, such as the number of spaces and the location of parking. Zoning regulates landscaping requirements. It regulates signage on a property. For example, there are rules on how many signs and what types of signs are allowed. Zoning code establishes processes and review procedures, including the rezoning process that we're talking about during this project. Zoning controls grading and earthwork that can be done on a property. And the zoning code has a section with definitions of words used throughout the code to help establish a common language. So we have talked about what zoning is and what it regulates. Now let's talk about the Denver Zoning Code and how it works. The code is first organized into different neighborhood contexts. Neighborhood contexts are defined areas of the city that differ from one another based on the existing and desired characteristics of the area. Within each neighborhood context, there are three main components. The first component are the zone districts, and there's a menu of zone districts, such as single unit residential or mixed use, in each neighborhood context. The second component are the design standards. The design standards define the types of buildings that are allowed and regulate building features, including their height and location. The third component are the rules and regulations that govern uses and parking. Now, let's talk about why we have different neighborhood contexts and what they are. The map on the right is from our citywide land use and transportation plan, Blueprint Denver. This map shows the future neighborhood contexts from the plan, but the contexts are the same and the locations align fairly closely with the current neighborhood context in the Denver zoning code. Each neighborhood context includes areas with similar existing and desired character of development or development patterns. For example, the suburban neighborhood context typically has houses on large lots with no alleys, while the urban neighborhood context has houses on small lots with rectangular blocks and alleys. Defining different neighborhood contexts helps to organize the city into areas that should have different requirements from one another. Within each neighborhood context, there are a variety of zone districts, and those zone districts have requirements that respond to the development patterns seen in the neighborhood context. Here is an example of what we mean by how the existing character or development patterns inform the neighborhood context. These images show photos and aerial views of the suburban and urban neighborhood contexts. Notice the difference in the development patterns between the two. The urban neighborhood context has more density, smaller lots, straight streets with rectangular blocks and alleys, while the suburban neighborhood context is less dense, has larger lots with curving streets but no alleys. The Denver Zoning Code's neighborhood contexts help zoning rules respond to these differences in character. I've given examples of the neighborhood contexts, and now here are the 6 main neighborhood contexts that show up in the Denver Zoning Code. Starting at the suburban neighborhood context, the top left, the neighborhood contexts typically become more dense and more urban as you move closer to downtown Denver. In addition to the 6 neighborhood contexts on the previous slide, the Denver Zoning Code also has special contexts and districts. These special contexts and districts are those that need to be treated differently due to specialized uses, forms, regulations, or procedures. The special contexts and districts have different zone district naming conventions described in each division in the Denver Zoning Code. So we've covered what a neighborhood context is. Now let's talk about how the zone districts are identified within each neighborhood context. Remember this map from the previous slide that shows the different zone districts? You might be asking yourself, what do all these letters and numbers mean? Or what does URH 2.5 mean? So we will explain. Let's first decode those numbers and letters. The first letter in any zone district identifies the neighborhood context. Then, within each neighborhood context, there are dominant building forms or characters such as single unit or mixed use. These also have a letter that represents their name. Finally, there are minimum lot size requirements or maximum height limitations that have a number or letter that represents the number of stories or the minimum lot size. So let's talk through an example, URH 2.5. The U means that it's within the urban neighborhood context. The RH means it has the row house dominant building form or character. And the 2.5 means that there's a maximum height of 2.5 stories allowed. This is an example of a zone district in the urban neighborhood context. And each context has a menu of different zone districts within it. So let's look at one more example, the CMX8 zone district. This zone district is within the urban center neighborhood context, has a mixed use dominant building form or character, and has a maximum allowed height of 8 stories. Let's talk about some of the main components of regulations within each zone district. First, we'll talk about design standards. Each zone district has a menu of building forms or types of buildings. Each building form has a set of standards that controls things such as the height of the building, how far it needs to be set back from the street, the amount of transparency at street level, and these building form standards sometimes differ between zone districts. The building form table on the right shows the urban neighborhood context, the zone districts within that context, the building forms, and then identifies which of the building forms are allowed in each zone district. There are building form illustrations like these in the Denver Zoning Code that are intended to show just one example of a building form and how it meets typical heights and characteristics which contribute to a consistent context for the neighborhood. The standards for building forms do not control specific shapes, roof styles, or architectural styles of a building. In the end, the goal of zoning is not to dictate the design of buildings. The goal is to allow for a variety of outcomes while ensuring certain standards are met. Let's move on to the last main component of each zone district: uses, parking, and limitations. As we've discussed, each neighborhood context has a menu of zone districts. These zone districts are broken down into two main categories. Residential zone districts allow for primarily residential uses with some incidental uses, such as institutional, community, or public service uses, as well as uses that are accessory to a residential use. The URH 2.5 zone district is an example of a residential zone district. The second category of zone districts are the commercial mixed-use zone districts. These zone districts allow for a greater mix of uses. They allow for commercial, retail, and business uses, and also permit residential uses. These zone districts do not require a mix of uses, and development in one of these districts could be solely residential or non-residential, depending on the development. Within each neighborhood context chapter, there is a table showing uses that are permitted in each zone district, their parking requirements, and a reference to any limitations on that use. The uses are categorized into use categories, and each of the uses has a specific parking requirement. The center portion of this table indicates whether a use is allowed in a certain zone district. This column also tells us if there are limitations on that use described in another section of the code, and which process is required to establish that use. For example, most of the uses here have the L-ZP designation. That means that these are permitted uses with limitations, and that a zoning permit review would be required to establish that use. Lastly, on the far right-hand column, this section shows where any applicable limitations can be found. This concludes the Zoning 101 presentation for the Advancing Equity in Rezoning project. If you would like to get involved, please visit our website where you can sign up for email updates, submit a question or comment, or complete an interest form if you would like to take a deep dive with us into Denver's rezoning process.